Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic Accord. Second episode of the week. Welcome. Thanks for listening. Today, I just want to get right to it. We are going to talk about an issue that I think is bigger than people expect, but no one's talking about it. Like, okay, it's covered, but with all the other chaotic events happening globally and domestically in the United States, just no one wants to talk about it. But this is the Uighur situation, I guess we could call it, that is happening in Xinjiang, China. And so I just want to give a little background. This is information I got from Foreign Policy magazine and The Economist, and just kind of highlights why we're at where we're at right now. So the far western region of Xinjiang is a place with nearly 7 times more land than Britain. This is far western China. It has oil reserves as big as Iraq's and more coal than Germany. It produces 1/5 of the world's cotton. The only big difference is that its income per person is about the same as Botswana. So it has large inequality and large poverty. And The Economist calls this a ticking time bomb. Basically, there are 2 ethnic groups inside this region, and they are very, very, very different. Historically, the region was a Uighur region that was conquered, I think, in the 19th century by the Han Chinese, who are more than 90% of China's population. So right now, in the Xinjiang region, 40% of the population are Han, and the other percentage are Uighurs. And these groups do not interact with one another, and they actually live in separate communities. The Hans live in much richer communities, and they dominate the region's economy. This separate community is called the Xinjiang Production and Construction Courts, or the Bingtuan. And these communities have their own police, hospitals, newspapers, and television stations. And also these communities dominate the region's economy. And the problem is that this just creates resentment, because geographically it is the north and the south of this region are divided by a desert, and the Uighurs, who are the Muslim ethnic minority, are mostly poor farmers who live south of the desert, and they struggle to compete with these giant Bingtuans. And so their economies are struggling, poverty is high, and they don't feel welcome. And so there are about 10 million Uighurs in this region, and they object to this state of affairs. Some have spoken out publicly if they're brave enough, though the Chinese state really does not like dissent. And a very small minority have become violent. And China has reacted by building a vast network of prison camps and tossing perhaps 1 million Uighurs into these quote-unquote vocational training facilities. The Chinese say these camps are needed because of the potential for terrorist attacks, but it's really hard to assess these claims when information is limited and foreign reporters are kept out of these locations. Various sources say that the numbers could be as high as 3 million who are detained, taken away from families, disappeared, etc. And sources cite detainees have said that there's alleged torture, sexual abuse, forced abortions, and the most shocking is the forced sterilization of detained Uyghur women. And so, thanks in part to the international community, the camps themselves are being put into the spotlight. But this is not good, because now actually the Chinese government, it has been reported, are moving some of these Uyghurs to just normal prisons, changing their names and disappearing them. And so it almost seems like more and more the Uyghurs are living in the Xinjiang region in somewhat of an apartheid regime. So it's pretty scary, Drew. So fun stuff to start with.
Yeah, it's definitely a heavy topic, this one. It does seem like a dystopia, like something out of an Orwellian fiction, right? The Han Chinese have basically created a police state, more so than the average Chinese city. In the we're gonna butcher some of these names, people, but the Xinjiang part of China has become a total dystopian police state. Again, multiple sources, The Economist in 2019 as well as Vice in 2019, have estimated that they're looking at over 1 million Uyghurs in re-education camps. You mentioned that. It's really disturbing and troubling. It's a pretty obvious attempt at a cultural genocide. It kind of started post 2001, right? 9/11 is when China started to. After 9/11, China started to really bolster what they called, anti-terrorism operations and anti-terrorist policies, specifically targeting the Muslims in this part of China. And from everything we read, right, it looks like this is a pretty like specific cultural genocide against the Uyghur population. China is not known to be very tolerant of religions in general, and they specifically see the Uyghurs, Muslims, as a threat. And it's just sad that something like this is happening out in the world, and a lot of the world doesn't really have the time or resources or care to pay much attention and really do something about it.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It is really troubling to me because I think we always think that we've seen, the Holocaust, the Armenian genocide, etc. And we think that, humans have gotten past this kind of dark tendency we have. Um, and and to me, this one is almost more disturbing because it seems like this is the first institution of technology to
Right.
actually create a police state. It was reported that the Chinese government forced Uyghurs to download certain apps onto their phones and
Mm-hmm.
spied on their messaging and other just very Orwellian practices, and
Face
so now,
face recognition, fingerprinting, the whole thing. I mean, it's
yes,
all there.
yes, it's horrible, and it's obviously, like you said, almost a textbook definition of attempted ethnic cleansing. It's a Uyghur minority in the region who obviously stands against kind of the Han vision,
Right.
and a country like China needs a homogenous, productive workforce. That's been throughout their history the case. And unfortunately, I think we're now seeing the malintent of that. Uh, it was called the China Cables. They were leaked documents that the New York Times obtained earlier this year, or sorry, I guess last year. I'm still in 2019, but these China Cables confirmed both the Chinese president Xi Jinping had called for showing no mercy against the weak, and that one senior Communist Party official tried to stop some of these repressive measures and was imprisoned himself. So it was made clear by these papers that the Chinese government does not want to show any softness, right? And see, to me, the problem is the international attention has been there but limited, and no one's doing shit about it. Excuse my language.
No, but it's true. So let's break it down, right? So first off, we have evidence that there is an ongoing ethnic cleansing going on in the Uyghur region of China. This has been acknowledged by various countries in the UN, and I'll get to that in a second. We also have in 2012 to 2017, China's domestic security budget doubled, but in this region where the Uyghurs live, the budget tripled. So we're seeing, like you said, an extensive implementation of a technologically based security police state. We're also now understanding that there's re-education camps with 1 million plus. Some say up to 3 million. Right. So again, we have literal concentration camps. And then, so what is the reaction? The reaction by the world has been very split. 23 countries and members of the UN have condemned China's Uyghur policies. This includes the United States, the United Kingdom, and Turkey as some of the big players. 54 UN countries voiced what they called approval of China's anti-terrorism campaign in Xinjiang. That includes countries like Belarus, Russia, Serbia, and these are all countries, and this is where I'm going with this. These are all countries that China needs to have in their Belt and Road Initiative. And this is where kind of an ulterior motive comes in, right? Why are they going for this big ethnic cleansing? On top of the fact that the Chinese government wants a unified people under the Communist Party, that's obvious. On top of that, there's an economic incentive, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. You mentioned this area has plenty of oil, 1/5 of the world's cotton. It's also a central point in between China and West Asia, like countries like, because this area, this Uyghur area borders Pakistan, Uzbekistan, very close to India, and it's a kind of and the Silk Road used to go through there, so it's a very obvious transport and hub for connecting China to the rest of the world in the Middle East, right? So it's going to definitely be a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. For listeners that haven't heard about this before in the podcast, we discussed it earlier in one of the other ones, I believe, in I think it was the Paradigm Shift episode. The Belt and Road is China's trying to build infrastructure within developed countries around the world to help with their economic goals, as well as gain influence over the world, right? And so it's a kind of a partnership with other countries, but that will definitely end up in China having more sway and more infrastructural power in the world. So it kind of plays into this, right? They don't want a population that going against their government or to have maybe more ties to their religion than they would the state, and it's such a central part of their economic plan.
I think you did an amazing analysis there, and it's completely true and hit it right on the head. Is that I think the timing in this is impeccable, and there's a lot of background reason for it. I think it was our third episode on the Trump presidency we did back in the day. We discuss this semi-issue as well, and for me, I think we've been seeing this for years, is that China now has UN Human Rights Council support. Right. I think it was Greece, and Serbia voted with China over the West on several issues. And so, to me, it makes sense is that China has been trying to cozy up with many of these more kind of borderline EU states that, could maybe find advantages in switching sides. And so it works out well, an economic alliance, a trade alliance, and you turn your head on what China's doing internally. Like for me, actually, for the Trump administration's defense, is that of a lot of the countries, Mike Pompeo and Trump have actually spoken out about putting more they have put more sanctions on China after this, which we can debate if sanctions work or not. But it's actually the Muslim world that surprises me very, very so with their reaction. Like I think you mentioned Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. All of them have basically questioned this information as fake news and seem to lay a large amount of trust on the Xi Jinping party.
Well, Turkey has condemned them, but you're right that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have not. Turkey has.
It was a very slow condemnation, though.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
And I think that's just it's just awful, despicable that the Muslim. I mean, again, we see that the Muslim world is not unified, unfortunately, but still there needs to be condemnation. But I mean, I think it's tough because the Chinese government isn't just powerful at home; it's powerful abroad. Mm-hmm. Like you were saying, it's that economic clout and sheer size that means that they probably, of any country, could cover up these Uighur issues for years to come. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I see parallels to World War II and the Nazi treatment of the Jews. Is that the West, I mean, mainly the United States, was not going to interfere at all with this because of ramifications worldwide. And I could see a lot of countries not wanting to interfere with China here. But then it comes down to a humanitarian issue, is that eventually this is going to seep over. And I'm sorry, I'm going off a little to the side here, but India is going through similar Islamic persecution. Modi, the president of India, I mean, I think this is just a trickle-down effect in Asia now, is that Modi, who is obviously a Hindu nationalist, has done a religious protection bill that excludes Muslims.
Right.
And so my fear is that if we turn an eye on China, then it's almost like turning an eye on a lot of the East and a lot of these Hindu nationalist Muslim collisions that we're seeing in places like Burma or Myanmar, and India. So I think it's bigger than just China.
Right. Well, I forget who said this, but it's kind of a famous idea of like, if there's injustice anywhere, then there is no justice. Then there is no justice anywhere.
Yeah.
So it's like you can't turn a blind eye to one thing and claim that you promote justice. So like, we're in that realm. We're in that part of the philosophical debate of like, guys, there's a active ethnic cleansing and cultural genocide going on. What are we going to do about it? Obviously the United States has condemned it. Again, 23 countries have condemned the Uyghur policies. It's now common knowledge. It's not like a conspiracy that this is happening. It's pretty much common knowledge that this is going on. But what's the next step? Obviously, the United States is engaged in a trade war with China, but that's not because of this. What's going on to the Uyghurs? That's kind of a side thing. And again, you said now it's happening as well in India. I mean, there's cultural genocides going on in Myanmar. It's happening all over the world, and it does make you wonder. What can we do, right? What kind of actions could we take to stop something like this? To stop something so powerful and entrenched in China's policies? I mean, again, this is a police state we're talking about with the largest economy on the planet. And now one of basically the world's world powers. I mean, China is a major player in the world. I would consider them a world power. So,
Oh yeah.
how do you stop something like that, especially when they're basically buying out support with freeways and infrastructure to smaller countries? It's going to be incredibly hard to stop something like this, and I don't think that media attention is going to be enough, right? Because it's out. It's the cat's out of the bag, and it's still happening.
Well, I mean, I think you summed it up well there is what do you do? Media attention is not going to be enough. It's just not, because it's almost like we've seen a great divergence. Like, last week we were talking about since 2016, there's been some changes in the world. Well, I would say probably since the early 21st century, China has been since probably the mid 90s, China has been growing exponentially, and it's quite difficult to stop. And I think as China's risen to the spot they're at, they've kind of given a pseudo-economic model for how to balance capitalism with state control.
Right.
And unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic on this, is that I think we've seen a great divergence between the West and the East. Samuel Huntington's cultural argument, I wouldn't use the culture in this. Instead, I'd say two forms of capitalism. And I mean, to be completely honest, I think other countries in the region, I think India is a perfect candidate. Myanmar, Russia, hopefully not any of our Korean allies, but I think that we're going to see China has basically used surveillance technology and racial profiling and has made it amazingly productive and successful. And I basically feel like it's only going to get worse before it gets better. Yeah. I think the West, like the typical West, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, United States, Canada, Mexico, I think we will probably stand against this, because I don't think it's in a lot of these countries' DNA. And those like Spain and Germany that have had issues like this have seen the repercussions and the danger of it. But I think the East is young. In forms of a unified country. And I think that they're almost going to have to learn trial by error. I don't know. It sounds bleak.
Well, again, I think we also have to remember, we can't ignore the blame on the Chinese people. I watched a Vice documentary about a journalist, and they had to consider themselves tourists, and then they had to lie to policing. They're just small travel bloggers, but these were real Vice journalists that went to Xinjiang and talked to Han Chinese people as well as Uyghurs when they could. I mean, they had to block out faces and change their voices because it's so dangerous to speak out against the government. But they talked to one lady on the train, and she was very casual in her knowledge of what was going on. They asked her, the Uyghurs, right? And she said, the Chinese government doesn't like the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs cause a lot of trouble. We want one China that's unified and everything. But then the journalist asked her, are you aware that they are sending Uyghurs to re-education camps? She said, yes, we all know. Yeah, take them, make them go away. And every Han Chinese person she talked to in that area, I think it's the city of Kargash or Kagrash. I can't pronounce some of these names, but
no problem. Me neither.
She spoke to Han Chinese people, and they were all aware of the re-education camps, the taking of orphans. We haven't discussed that a bit, but they're also taking orphans of Uyghur families, putting them in kindergartens where they aren't allowed to speak any Uyghur languages. They aren't allowed to use their Uyghur name, and they have to pledge their allegiance to the Chinese government. This is exactly the thing that the United States used to do with Native Americans way back in the day, a cultural genocide to get rid of a culture that they deemed undesirable. We're seeing it today with the Uighurs and with kids in kindergartens. But the thing is every Han Chinese person knew this was going on. See, in World War II, when we spoke to German families, we'd be like, hey, did you guys realize that there was a concentration camp 3 miles away? A lot of them said, no, we had no idea. Or no, I thought it was just a coal factory. I'm sure many of them were lying. But the German people tried to be like, we didn't know this was happening. We knew that Jews had to wear a star and they couldn't have could read their books, but we had no idea that they were being killed in concentration camps. It seems like in this instance, the Han Chinese people do know, and they're okay with it. And that's going to be really hard to break. I mean, if you have the vast majority of the people that are completely fine with it, it has to be an outside force, and I just don't see that happening.
And I think that's a fair point. People, I mean, the population, I think, is always the barometer to what is happening inside of a country. But that being said, I want to step back and kind of I have to disagree somewhat with it being hard to sway the people, because I mean, actually complacency was a huge issue inside of Nazi Germany, right? Obviously not to the point where people knew Jews were going off to the ovens. Unfortunately, that sounds horrible, but there was the fact that the German people seemed to be okay with alienating Jews and othering Jews. And so, I mean, it sounds like from what you were describing in this Vice documentary, it's very similar, where the people, based on the knowledge they are given, are very okay with othering the Uighurs, right? Like, oh, they cause terror, they cause violence. It's better if it's one China. And like the normal German citizens who didn't stand up against the Holocaust, these Hans are just complacent to the system they're in. Propaganda is strong. I mean, the Chinese government is pushing the narrative that the Uighurs are responsible for extreme terrorism, which they are not. There's very low levels of terrorism, but it's this Islamic fear, that is stricken the world. But I mean, I think it was similar in Nazi Germany, where I think the Jewish people were scapegoated as the ones that had kind of tainted Nazi society. And I think at the time, as a person, complacency is just what happens. And so I think that the Han people were, I mean, I think the problem is that it all comes back to this, is we had to get rid of the Nazi party for Germany to change.
Right.
And I think that China needs to get rid of the Communist Party. And I honestly, going on to that, I actually think that is more likely than a lot of people think. Maybe not in the next 5 or 10 years, but maybe in 15 or 20.
Maybe with the death of Xi Jinping, maybe something else will happen after, or something like that.
Yeah, potentially, exactly. Because, I mean, the Hong Kong protesters held a rally in solidarity with China's Uighur Muslims on Sunday. And I think that's showing that China's facing more and more internal problems, right? Like the Hong Kong protesters and the Uyghurs, or especially the Hong Kong protesters, these are millennials, progressive, educated Chinese students,
right,
know the Uyghur issue and are siding with the Uyghurs. And I think eventually it's either going to turn in violence or potential change, and maybe both.
Yeah. But I mean, perhaps it's going to be a while, though, because the Hong Kong protesters are a way different group of people than the average Han Chinese person in the countryside.
Of course.
It doesn't look good. I just wonder, like, obviously we're not doing enough, but I just don't know what the world could do. I mean, other than a full-scale war, which would be awful. You know what I mean? Like what other option is there? Sanctions? Yeah, but we're already engaged in a trade war. Perhaps, but I don't really see China, changing their policies that drastically because of some sanctions. Especially since this does tie into their long-term economic goals. It's not like this is on a whim, right? It's not like, oh, okay, well, we'll just let the Uyghurs be, and because people got mad, so we'll let the Uyghurs be. Like, no, I mean, I people are already mad, and they don't seem to really care.
That's a very fair point, and I mean, I think you addressed what I was thinking about when I was researching this topic, was what really can there be done? With a lot of topics, you can go on to Google Scholar or on the top, periodicals, and there's always opinion articles or scholarly articles about potential solutions, but I barely saw anything all over the internet
Right.
on solutions for this. It was all, yes, the U.S. is speaking out, or I don't know, the UN and the United Nations are talking about it, but like you said, it just doesn't seem enough, especially when it interferes with China's like 100-year goal.
Right.
And I mean, that's the issue with a country like China, is that, I mean, if you look at Chinese history, which I'm no scholar at, but I mean, their entire history involves long-term plans, long-term planning. And I mean, unfortunately, I think this is a cultural thing that, I mean, the West just doesn't understand. I mean, China's older, like Chinese empires and Chinese dynasties are older than anything we could fathom in the West. And they've kind of done this by central planning. And this sounds cold, but central planning involves exactly what they're doing now. It's like China's an old regime and empire that's unfortunately facing with modernity.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're well, and they're they're adapting pretty well, I would say, as far as the police state. I mean, it is amazing that you have such an effective and technologically advanced police state. Um, Facial recognition, the whole thing, downloading apps on your phone to spy on your conversations. It is like back to what we started with. It's very dystopian, right? I mean, if I had to write what a modern police state would look like, it would be Xi Western China. This is the stuff that Orwell warned us about, and that we're seeing in pretty broad daylight. Um, Sad. It's sad and scary, and I also think that I think it's hard to understand completely because we're so far removed. You know what I mean? I feel like before all this came out, I bet you most people had never even heard of what a Uyghur Muslim was. I bet you most people didn't even realize Muslims lived in China. And
Yeah.
and now we're learning about this dystopian police state. It's like it's so shocking and so far removed. And again, I think you also mentioned it too, that a lot of people probably just assume that the Holocaust is something of the past, and we would never let something like that happen again today. And the reality is, guys, we are. It is. That's it. It is happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a shame, and I mean, what I have to ask you is, do you think, I mean, we were talking about potential solutions, which I think there are barely any, but do you think holding tech companies more accountable, or maybe regulating what happens with tech companies, could be a start? Because certain social media apps have a bunch of Chinese investors,
Right.
first off, and there's a lot of American tech companies that have a lot of influence in China.
Right.
And a lot of algorithms that were developed in the U.S. have been utilized in China. And I don't know if it's a solve all, but I think maybe some form of regulating these tech companies and looking at them as public goods could be a start.
Yeah, that's like Google agreed to do, to censor some of its search engine algorithms based on China's censoring regulations when they're trying to get a deal to be allowed into Chinese internet system, but then regulate what the search engine is. I think that they should be punished, right? Like, you're an American company, especially someone like Google, where it's like, oh, free and open information for the world, but then you agree to a deal in China that censors what people search for. There should be some backlash, and maybe a fine or something like that in the United States. Like, hey, man, you can't just like do business and then go promote anti-democratic things, and go against human rights, and then act like you're some like totally cool hip tech company from America that's like, yeah, we're the way of the future, that we also support dystopian regimes. You're right. I think that's a good point. Is like, maybe you can't go directly to China and stop the problem, but you can at least encourage our connections with China to be better about what they do, to be better about the businesses they do. We did blacklist some companies related to this Uyghur thing. I saw that Pompeo had mentioned that, but I think most of our sanctioning and trade stuff is just because of our trade disputes with China. I would just include some of the Uyghur stuff in our trade disputes. I would be like, again, I'm not an expert on on everything, but if we do have some leverage in the trade war, I would try to use that to at least promote human rights in the Western region. But I'm not sure that's a priority for us right now.
Yeah. No, I think that was a good analysis, and I mean you're right. I don't know if that isn't our priority. Unfortunately, I don't think Americans in general know what our priority is over there.
That's true.
Um, um, I, I think the diagnosis, like a lot of Trump things, is correct on China's foul play. But unfortunately, I would almost worry that what we're doing is just going to isolate us from China when maybe we actually do need to talk.
Well, I think what we need to do is get more of these periphery allies
Yes.
because I mean, based on the UN condemnations versus approval, we're losing that war. We're losing that war of influence among the world. That China obviously has enough votes, like we talked about, is getting enough votes in the UN to be immune to some of these things, and that is
Jesus.
very scary. So I think, okay, if we can't go directly to China and tell them to stop this genocide, because obviously they're not going to do that, we have to go for the periphery. We have to go for all the allies that they're trying to influence. You know what I mean? We have to come back and at that Belt and Road Initiative and we have to be the more attractive ally than China is. And I'm just not sure we're doing that with this kind of, you know, isolationist America first foreign policy, when we really need to be going, no, guys, we need to be unifying the West against China's influence. And that's just not happening at a fast enough rate.
That's a that's a great point, and I mean it's true. China for a long time was considered this isolated kingdom that wasn't
Right.
open to trade, right? And they have opened their arms, and
Hmm.
basically, I mean, what I would call the Belt and Road Initiative, excuse me, is just a Chinese version of the Marshall Plan.
Right.
And the Marshall Plan. I mean, there's controversy about the Cold War and everything happening at the time, but the Marshall Plan did gain us a lot of friends. Because at the end of the day, your friends don't really care about your values as a country. They care about the infrastructure and the money you give. And China's proving that once again. Is that loans are nice in Africa. The highways, infrastructure, etc., that they have built there. One day they're going to come to call for it, and that could mean votes on the UN Human Rights Council, or that could mean necessary troops for whatever conflict could conspire. And I'm just worried that China is winning the PR game
Right.
and their soft power is growing while Trump believes that hard power is the only solution.
Right. Yeah. That's a very good analysis. We're losing the soft power game. We might have more nukes and more military and all that, but we're losing our circle of influence around the world is shrinking, and I believe China's circle of influence in the world is increasing, and that is scary.
Yeah.
That is scary because we don't want the one that has the more influence being okay with cultural genocide.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, on that fun note,
So fun.
yeah, on that positive, uplifting news, that's going to
Yeah.
conclude our episode today for the Tonic Accord podcast. I hope you at least found this interesting and eye-opening if you hadn't heard of this problem before. And I'd always thank you for tuning in. Alex, anything you want to say before we get out of here?
That was a fun, well, not fun discussion. That's not a good word to use. Hopefully, an informative discussion. And please let us know what you think.
Yes.
And I request that everyone comments, either if you like it, you hate it, you have requests, you have feedback. Let us know. It helps us in the algorithms and the rankings. And tell your friends. Let's keep a good discussion going because I think it's important. So, with that, have a great week, and we'll see you guys next week.
Take care, everyone.